Today we're going to be sculpting detail on an earthworm. And so maybe the first thing to do is just to take a look at what an earthworm looks like. That's always a good place to start. And I did some, there we go. So I did a little bit of image searching and looking in some science image stock imagery databases and stuff like that. And so we'll sort of talk about various features as we go along, but basically what I want to do is, starting with a base mesh that I made very quickly, add in these segments here, the clitellum here, this area, probably the prostomium in the mouth, the setae, which are kind of little projections on the bottom. I think we've got a better picture here of the setae. So we've got setae and the divisions here, the prostomium and the mouth that we'll sort of think about. And I think these are the vas deferens openings, or this one here. I didn't get a lot of reference for this area, so maybe we'll just kind of skip it. But if you want to create a scientifically accurate model, you got to think about all the surface anatomy and stuff like that. And of course, you know your life is good when you're Googling earthworm anuses. And so we'll make sure we include that. Okay, so, but what we have to do is, because we're not going to be talking about, or my recommended workflow is not to generate the model in Mudbox, is actually to generate the model in Maya. So what I had to do was think about how I wanted to start that out. So I've provided a base mesh for you, and maybe we'll just jump into Mudbox. So with this little welcome screen, you just need to hit close, not exit Mudbox, but just close, and you're going to be presented with just a blank scene. So in order to bring base geometry into Mudbox, you can go File, Import, and then we need to navigate to where the Mudbox actual file is. Unlike Maya, which has a very nice project-based structure, Mudbox doesn't have that sort of project set up initially. So what I tend to do is all of the Mudbox files, I'll still put them within the Maya project structure. So this would be the top level of my Maya project. You can see that we have that workspace.mel file that's indicative of the Maya project. We've got our Maya scene folder. We've got the reference, which is where I had those images from. And what I ended up doing was I modeled the base mesh that we're going to bring in, and I exported that as an OBJ, and I put that into a data folder. I like to put the earthworm, the earthworm, but also the OBJ exports, I like to put that into a data folder. So I'm going to choose this earthworm base.obj, and an OBJ file, in case I haven't really talked about this before, is a model file that has limited information with it, or it really only takes with it relevant information. So it brings UV maps with it. It brings I think it respects the normal information, whether you have softened or hard normals, but it doesn't bring any of the history, the modeling history with it, and it doesn't have anything else that is associated with a Maya scene. So it's kind of a lightweight version of your model. And I recommend, if you're having problems with a model, sometimes a way to fix it is to export your model as an OBJ out of Maya and re-import that OBJ into a new Maya scene, and that kind of can clean out some of the, at times that can help by cleaning out some bad history or unnecessary nodes or other things that might be causing problems with your file. So with this earthworm base selected, I'm going to double click on it, or click open or import. And the first thing that you might notice is that this thing is really tiny. And that's because I did what I tell you to do, which is to model to scale. And so in Maya, I made this maybe about 15 centimeters long. That kind of made sense to me. But when I bring this into Mudbox, it's really too small to work with. I mean, you can make the brush sizes like maybe working with a brush size of 0.05 and a strength of like I worked with this for a bit, and I realized that there are things that just don't work very well. So this is kind of an exception to the rule of modeling to scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new scene. I'm not going to save that. And I'm going to hit close again. And this time I'm going to import a different object. And this one has been scaled up 100 times. So if I hit open, you can see that this is a much more natural size in the viewport. And in Maya, this object actually it takes up about the same proportion of the grid, because while Mudbox and Maya use the same units, in Maya, one of these grid ticks is 1 centimeter or 1 unit, whereas in Mudbox, one of these grid ticks is 100 units. So it's kind of off by a factor of 100, and that's a little bit frustrating, but it's something that we can deal with just by scaling it up in Maya. The reason why I didn't scale it up in Mudbox, you could theoretically get the scale tool and scale it up in Mudbox, but I found that caused some other problems. So I found it worked a bit better to just scale it up in Maya before I exported it. Okay, so now that we have this base geometry, let's just take a little bit of a look at it. I'm going to hit W to show the wires, the wireframe on this shaded object. This object is basically just a cylinder with a little bit of a rounded end. You'd notice that I do have quads on the end of the geometry, and you'll notice that it's also symmetrical. So the first time I modeled this, I kind of had the quads, or had this rotated, so one of the faces was sitting at the top, and then it had kind of a grid down here, and that didn't allow for an edge to run along this axis of symmetry, which will be important as we sculpt it. The other thing that you might notice is that all of the, or at least I tried, the faces are roughly equally sized across the model, and that's going to help as well in the sculpting process, because if you had a model that had really, really small faces, a really dense area of the mesh, and then a really broad area of the mesh with large faces, as you subdivide it, the area with the dense mesh is going to get even more dense, and going to get dense much more quickly, whereas areas that had a lower sort of resolution at the beginning will have larger faces, and it's going to create some unevenness over your model. So as much as possible, and it's not always possible, but as much as possible, try to have sort of evenly sized quads across your model. Okay, so the last thing that I want you to notice about this model is if we click on the tab that says UV view, this is going to be a little hard to see because I've changed the background. Let's see if I can let's turn on the gradient background. Does that change anything? No, it doesn't. Well, anyways, whether or not you can see it, if in your own UV view, you can see that in one of these UV squares, I have this nicely UV mapped. And so we've got some clean UVs to work with. And that's important when we actually are exporting texture and detail maps once we're finished sculpting. So like I said at the beginning in the lecture part, the ideal workflow is to create your base mesh in Maya, UV map it properly, and then export it as an OBJ and bring that into Mudbox. Now let's say we were going to be having this earthworm in a scene and it was going to be all bended and twisty. Excuse me. What you could do is model it all bended and twisty and then sculpt it in Mudbox as bended and twisty and just use that. The reason that I've brought this in and just as a long straight object as opposed to this guy here, which is all twisted, are a few reasons. One is that it's a lot easier to UV map when it's straight, as you might be aware if you've done a little bit of UV mapping. The other reason is that if we were going to animate this worm, instead of just having it as a static object, it would be a lot easier to rig when it's straight as opposed to when it's bent. And the other benefit, and this is going to be relevant in Mudbox here, is that because it's straight, we can work with symmetry on. And so we can sculpt on one half of the model, and it's automatically going to be applied on the other half. So that's a reason why we would want to keep this sort of a symmetrical shape. let's go into the Sculpt tool here. I'm going to select the Sculpt tool, and I'm just looking at the mirror here. So there's various mirroring axes, and if I choose local Z, that's going to be mirroring right split down the middle of the worm. And so that's gonna work for us. But in case that it was something, if this was like slightly off axis, or it wasn't, maybe, I'm not sure exactly how lenient Mudbox can be, but there's a way that we can define the axis of symmetry just to make sure that Mudbox knows how to apply that properly. So the way that we can do that is going to the select move tools, clicking faces, and we just want to make the brush a bit smaller and just select 2 faces. Now, the way that Mudbox by default renders this out is it creates this kind of soft edge to them. So I'm going to undo that, and I can actually change how that is displayed under the preferences. So we'll go Mudbox preferences, and under the render tab, instead of render selected by vertex, we want render selected by face. So render selected by face. And now you'll notice that if I click on the faces again, then we actually have that specific face selected. So it's highlighting that. So I'm just going to undo that, and I'm just going to turn mirroring off so that I can show you how this works. So you'd select one and shift select the other. And then we're going to go to edit, set topological axis. And you'll see at the bottom this little indicator says symmetry initialized. And that just tells Mudbox, okay, these are 2 faces that are adjacent along the axis of symmetry. And so that's the axis of symmetry that, that's the symmetry that Mudbox is going to be using. Okay, so we are going to want to make sure that with the Sculpt tool selected, we have the mirroring set to local Z. And so now if we zoom in on the model, you can see that the 2 brush indicators are showing that we've got those mirrored. So in order to sort of start working on this, I'm going to subdivide this a couple times. So I'm going to hit Shift D once, and then Shift D a second time, and then we've bumped up to level 2. And so now we've got about 10,000 polygons. And in the object list here, you can see that we've got 3 levels. So that's level 0, level 1, and level 2. Looking back at a reference, I can see that it's relatively the same sort of diameter along its length, except for at the back end and the front end, and there's also this bulge here. So I think I'm just going to try to smooth that out and try to get those areas roughly the right size. So I'm going to select the bulge tool, which we haven't talked about yet, but this bulge tool either inflates or sort of deflates the object. So I'm going to select the bulge tool, and I'm also going to make sure that my brush is quite large, something like size 100 or something like that. And with the control key selected and the strength down a fair bit, we'll see how this goes, but we might need to play with those. With the control key held down, I'm just going to sort of stroke along the length here. And so you can see that as I'm sort of gently stroking along the length, it's being pushed in. And I can also hold down the Shift key and drag over that some more to smooth it out. And in fact, the Smooth tool actually does a pretty decent job of sort of smoothing that inwards. Okay? And so we can go to the other end, and again, holding down the control key, we can kind of do the inverse function of the bulge tool and get that. Maybe that's a bit too much, right? But I can again, with the Shift, I'm just stroking along the axis here and smoothing it out. And we had that, so I need to decide which is the head and which is the tail. I guess this should be the tail. So I'll make that a little pointier, and maybe I'll bulge this out a little bit more again. So not using the control key to do the bulge. If I really went for it, you can see how the bulge tool works. And that might be a good way to make the clitellum, which we're going to get to in a sec here. But we also have this sort of enlargement in the area close to the head. And again, I'm not an earthworm anatomist, so very good chance that I'm going to get some stuff wrong here, but the point is to get as close as you can to the references that you find. Okay, so that's maybe a good start to the rough shape. So now maybe I'm going to work on the clitellum. So the bulge tool would work for that, but I'm going to demonstrate a slightly different one. This is called foamy, and foamy just kind of builds up the area, so that also kind of works. So I'm going to make the brush a bit smaller, and I'm just going to sort of stroke back and forth here and sort of build that up. And because we've got symmetry on, you want to make sure that you got symmetry on, it's going to be relatively symmetrical. And so with the shift key, I'm just smoothing that out. And it maybe is a little lumpy, so I can, again, smooth that out a bit more. Make sure that I'm kind of getting the rough general proportion of this. So that's with the foamy tool. And we'll worry about making this end a little more defined, or where the clitellum ends more defined a little bit later on. So the other thing, I don't know how much this is, this will be accurate, but it's worth kind of talking about, is if your earthworm was sort of sitting on the ground, then maybe because it's kind of a squishy, soft squishy object, the bottom of it would be sort of flattened out. So maybe if we go under the bottom, we could use the flatten tool and kind of flatten out some of the areas that are going to be sitting more on the bottom of the or sitting on the floor, as it were. We can kind of, and this might be a bad idea, particularly because it's hard to get something in sort of an even plane with the smooth or with the flatten tool, but we can kind of flatten out sort of the bottom of the cylinder a little bit. Just a little bit anyways. And if there was an area that wasn't really meeting our fancy, we could take the grab tool with sort of a large radius, and we could kind of grab parts of it and sort of pull up and down to kind of even it out. Okay, so the next sort of major feature that I think we want to deal with are the actual segments, the rings. So in this for the rings, I'm going to subdivide one more time. So I'm going to hit Shift D, and we're going to jump up to level 3. And this time I'm going to actually work in a Sculpt layer. So I'm going to go to the Layers tab, and I'm going to hit the white page icon for the new layer. It's important to make sure also that you're in the Sculpt tab as opposed to the Paint tab. Those are two sort of separate areas, and we'll deal with painting in another class. But we've got a Sculpt layer. I'll double click on it and call this Rings. And so we're going to be sculpting in this layer to make this individual segments. So we have the Rings layer, and I think I experimented with a few different ways of making these rings, but one way that seems to work relatively well is just with the regular Sculpt tool. So with the Sculpt tool selected, I'm going to choose a brush size that's proportional to how big I want the rings to be. But instead of just sculpting directly, I'm going to change a couple of things. One thing I'm going to do is change the fall off, so that instead of a smooth fall off, we can scroll down to where the fall off is stored. I want a kind of, well, let's see here. I want something more like this. No, I want something more like this, but then also have the profile be quite sharp. I don't know if that's like a reverse exponential kind of curve. And the other thing that I want to do under advanced is I want to make sure that the minimum size of the brush is 100%. So what that means is that what it was at, by default, 25%. That means the very softest that you touch on the tablet is going to give 25% of the brush size and 0% of the strength. And the hardest you're going to push is going to be 100% of both. But I want it set to, regardless of how hard I press on the tablet, I want it to have the maximum brush size. And so that's going to create a consistent ring length, right? So I'm going to reduce the strength a little bit, and then all I need to do is just kind of start sculpting on the edge and the next one. Maybe I'll do them a little bit farther away so that we kind of get, whoops, we get a little bit of a gap in between them. Not much of a gap. This might take a little bit of sort of back and forth to kind of get those rings. And then as we get towards the tail, these segments are going to get narrower. And so I'm going to reduce the brush size a little bit and continue on. And then reduce the brush size a little bit and continue on. Now, obviously, if this was going to be a portfolio piece or something for a production, you want to take more care about this. But I'm just kind of quickly going along, reducing the brush size as I go. And you'll notice that I'm not getting all the way down to the bottom, so you would also want to kind of come underneath and make sure that you've got these rings. And then with the shift, you can also sort of smooth this out a bit. I find it's better to work relatively softly and then work over it, sort of do several strokes to kind of build it up, similar to how you might paint in Photoshop. But it's really kind of up to you how you want to. All right, so now these rings are getting relatively tight together. I think I read somewhere that earthworms can have like, I don't know, like 100 different segments or 100 segments along their length, which is a lot. I probably won't be doing that many. All right, all the way down to the end. And those ones are probably too strong, so I'll bring down the strength as well and kind of. Okay, so while we're at this end, this is the tail end, we might as well build in the anus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I think, reset the fall off to just kind of the standard brush, and I'm also going to reduce the minimum size back down to 25%, which was the default. And then I'm just going to sort of smooth that out and kind of build, oops, that's too strong. Kind of build the end, but then something like that, and then with the pinch, bring it together. And that's a bit ugly, but we can also add more subdivision levels and sort of refine that if we wanted to. You can see that this is quite stretched out here. That's one thing to watch for, is even though we have quite a lot of polygons here, you can see that in this area they're getting quite stretched out, and so it's getting some nasty artifacting a little bit. But that's okay. We can we could spend more time there if we wanted to, but I'd rather not spend too much time there, if you know what I mean. Coming back onto this side, we can keep sculpting the rings. I'm going to bring the, whoops, this fall off area is a little finicky sometimes. Okay, something like so. And increase my brush size here. Whoops, we're on the pinch brush. That's, yep, so now I gotta set that back up again. Sorry about that. Bring the strength back up. Not that much. And just very quickly kind of going along here and building in the rings. And reducing the brush size as we go along. Okay, that's probably a bit too much there. All right, and we could also work on the prostomium. And I noticed that, prostomium, I think that's right. I noticed that when I was sculpting the anus, I was working on this layer, and that's probably not what I would have wanted to do. So for this prostomium in the mouth, I'm going to come back off the layer and just sculpt in the just in the regular knot on a layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the control key and kind of sculpt in a bit here, and that's getting ugly, so I'm going to smooth that out a bit. And I'm also going to get the bulge tool, and whoops, with the brush, with the weight quite a bit lower, the strength quite a bit lower, and a larger size, maybe bulge that up a bit. And we could also use the grab tool, for example, and kind of push and pull this around until we get something that suits us. Okay, so again, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but maybe that is a little bit like that, kind of. I could probably spend a lot more time on that. But you get the idea. So working with some of these different tools to sort of shape the area and get the effect that you want.